thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. And I have to say, Richard, that I think one of the great pleasures in life is when you see somebody that has a terrific skill, whether they're playing a musical instrument or maybe pitching a baseball, but now we're watching the maestro here sort of engaging everybody, and it's great to see, and thank you. And also, Richard, I just want everyone to know how much effort has come into not only writing the case, but bringing everyone here. Certainly Richard and Kathy and everybody at the Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator have spent an enormous amount of time to do this. So it's terrific to be here, and really they just recognize the terrific work that everyone's done. So I've just been taking some notes here and listening, and I'll just kind of start, Krishna, with you. You know, we did have this maybe field of dreams idea that if we build it, they will come. And we did not get baseball players coming out of the cornfields here, but a couple of key points. So Lee, you mentioned this, and Rebecca, you did as well, about incentives. Incentives really matter. And so that anybody that's ever set up maybe an incentive compensation program at work, you know that these incentives do work, and it's so important. One of the things we've learned to align the incentives around what's going to drive things for our patients. So Lee and Rebecca, that really resonated with me when you said that. Another thing, and Richard, it was kind of an overlying theme, but something I guess I want to emphasize here, is that people matter. And the leadership matters, and that you really do need you've heard the term, the coalition of the willing. You need the coalition of people that are willing to do that, because Lincoln, as you were saying earlier, there are a lot of institutional barriers to prevent this. So you need those champions that really will raise their hand and kind of say, yeah, I'll embrace this idea and move it ahead. And Lincoln, one other thing that you did mention that resonated with me also is this idea that ideas matter. I mean, this is something new. We're trying something new. Whether it works in the long run or not, I think we've had some initial successes, but we want to just keep trying new things, another turn of the wheel. And Lincoln, when you were talking about that and coming back to this idea of focusing on questions that will resonate and that will answer questions for our patients. Now, one of the things that Richard asked me to do also is to give an update, and I'll be happy to do that. In terms of the high-risk aspect, those projects are well underway. I see Constantine, I see you, and Larry, you're here, and there are two of the leaders on these projects and moving these things ahead, trying to identify some new targets for in multiple myeloma, and so those things are moving ahead. Now, some of these things I know take time. We all are very much, and certainly at the MMRF, are focused on speed and acceleration. I've heard somebody say, though, once that even if you put 9 pregnant women in a room, you don't get a baby in a month. So I think that there's a little bit of that some of this does take time, but I know all of us were moving it ahead, and I know there's a lot of collaboration and sharing of information, which is one of the things that we're trying to drive. Now, in terms of the second piece, the maintenance therapy, let's see. Mark, you were mentioning this, and Amitabh, you were talking about maintenance and the importance of it. First of all, it was important because that was an idea of crowdsourcing a question from the patients, from the patient community, which is an idea that we've, certainly Kareem Lakhani at Harvard just talks about crowdsourcing not only questions, but not only answers, but questions. And so it was something that we tried. And really this idea of maintenance therapy came up. And when you think about it, even when we talk to community oncologists all the time, they say, well, look, this is a point where I've got to decide, are you on maintenance therapy or not? Are you going to proceed with this or not? And they need to make, and the patients are there, they have to make a decision. So it became clear that this was an important question to get answered. Now, where we are on this is that we are now proceeding. We're still in some of the negotiations with a variety of different groups about can we marry a data and analytics firm with an organization that has a database. Can we put all this together? And how do we do that and move it forward? So I will tell you that it's not easy, that there's questions that are surrounding from a legal standpoint, from an IP standpoint, from a process standpoint, from a business standpoint. But those are things that are moving ahead, and I am confident that one way or another we will get all this resolved, but it's not, that is still in process. One of the other questions that has come up also, the next thing that we will be looking at is the idea of transplant. Are there specific markers, if you would, for certain individuals that indicate that you'll have a favorable outcome from a transplant or not? Again, this is something that comes up with our patients because they have to make a decision. They're sitting there with their doctor, do I get a transplant or not? If there's ways for us to go ahead and be predictive about that, that's something that really would be important. And finally, in the case, it mentioned at the end the idea of the cure cloud. And what the cure cloud is the latest thing that we'll be launching. In fact, we'll be launching it later this month. And what the cure cloud is it's kind of taking, what I'll call it is, in some ways, it's Compass on steroids, in that we really are trying to generate a bigger and bigger data set, in many ways going direct to patients and doing it at a lower cost and more efficiently, because our view, and I think many of you have expressed this during these discussions, is that we do need to generate more data, aggregate more data, and have that data available for our researchers, for scientists, everybody to interrogate and understand. I think, and so that's kind of the summary. And then Rebecca, just so you know, I did survive the board meeting, so I'm still here. So I guess I did something right there. So with all of that, that's kind of the summary, and those are some of the thoughts and some of the learning that I heard from you, and I just wanted to echo back. So again,
we have 5-7 minutes here. Questions for Paul? Chris, please.
Hey.
If there's anything we could learn from breast cancer, for example, because there, we have actually now well-validated genetic tests with subsets of genetic markers which can predict outcome or a lot of questions. And so I'm wondering kind of what are lessons to be learned from other cancers that we could probably follow along in the footsteps. My conclusions from breast cancer, for example, are that, these early data sets are really used for generating hypotheses and to figure out which questions we might ask and where we might need to go out and run data. But that at the end of the day, a lot of data needs to be acquired to really answer questions, especially in statistically significant ways. We just saw the results of the Taylor X, for example. That was a 10,000-person trial, of which 1,800 patient subset were very, very specific to a very specific question. And so I think, we might maybe take lessons from other disease indications who have, I would say, made more progress with these genetic markers for the myeloma field potentially.
Well, let me respond to that in two ways. One is that's a little bit of a commercial for what Richard and Kathy and what they're doing at the Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator, because what they have done, and they can speak for themselves later, but they have brought together a variety of different cancers in different areas to share best practices, and including one of them is breast cancer. So I think that that's one of the things that we need to be careful of, certainly in the myeloma community or any of these, that we don't just develop our own silo and just talk to ourselves, but we look across others for the best answers. So they'll, I know, talk to that a little bit later. The one other thing, though, and this is something that that Brad had mentioned, was that the Compass did do a lot of hypothesis generating. That's one of the reasons why we're looking to the idea of generating the cure cloud, because to get a bigger N, more patients, and do things that ultimately, if we can get it so that it can be predictive of which treatment out would be the best, that's really the way where we're trying to end up. We're not there yet, and we don't have quite enough data yet.
Ann, did you want to comment? Brady, I also saw you had a question. How do we want to go?
Yeah, I've had comments on and off, and then other people address them, which is fantastic. The one thing I wanted to raise, and it's not the case, and quite frankly, maybe I shouldn't admit this on HBX, but it really didn't occur to me until this discussion, that since we launched Compass, there have been 6 new drug approvals in multiple myeloma and probably 15 new indications. So there's the matter of having enough data in terms of subtyping patients by genomics or immune of anything else, but just coming up with enough data so that we understand all of these drugs and all these different populations. We didn't have that challenge when we launched Compass. It was a much simpler landscape than we have today, and it just means that we do need more data, but we also need more clinical data.
And hopefully that'll be the case in all cancers. There are lots of
Right.
treatments available, and we all know we'll discover more and more subtypes. It's just the way. Brady, you had a question?
Yeah, question, probably slash comment, but following on the lessons theme, I guess, is when I'm come more from the tech side, so I'd really be interested. You guys do a great job of creating these kind of real use cases, real world use cases. I think it might be really important for MMRF as they're looking at the Cure Cloud and other work that they're doing to collect maybe some good and bad real world use cases around examples of data collection, collaboration. When you start to think about organizations that are out there that are scaling, but still running through some significant challenges, organizations like the Orion Network, you've got Cancer Cloud and the GDC and stuff that's going on there with they kind of mandate sharing of data if they get an NCI grant, but the reality is even sharing that data is difficult because the people who get the grants don't have the people to aggregate and curate the data to get back into the GDC. St. Jude, Precision FDA, there are a lot of these different types of organizations that are scaling in different ways. One of the capabilities you guys have as you're looking down this path is to, I think, accelerate some of your learning, like I said, both in the good and the bad within those use cases, because you can go really deep in some real world use cases. They've been going on for the last 3 to 5 years and not just over the last, 1 or 2 years. So I'd highly recommend looking into and do accelerating maybe some deep dive into those areas to support your decisions.
Akwasi, you haven't had a chance yet, so I'd love to get your question.
Thanks,
please.
Brady.
That was great. Appreciate it, Brady. Please.
Yeah, so I think as I was reading the case, sort of coming from an academic background, I think the piece that was missing for me was the role of consumers or patients in this. I think the piece we sort of alluded to was a lot of the initial funding, I'm assuming, went into the cost of actually sequencing the initial 1,000 people, right? With the rise or with the increase of consumer genomics, I think there's a way where you can now rapidly start to sequence people for much cheaper, and you can start to aggregate some of those data sets. So I'm interested to figure out if MMRF has started to think through ways you start to work with folks in the consumer genomic space to get that 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people data set that are subtyped by the various sub-indications that the clinical researchers would be interested in.
Well, a couple of really good points there, and just address them. We haven't directly worked with any of the consumer groups yet, the 23andMe's or the Ancestry.coms or any of those. But one of the things, and this is a very good point you're bringing out, is that when you look at the $40 million that was spent for Compass, that is to sequence and then follow 1,154 patients over these years. And so you think about that, that's roughly $35,000 per patient. When you look at the projected cost now on the Cure Cloud and doing this because the cost of sequencing has come down, because we're going to be doing some of these things using blood biopsies instead of bone marrow, that some of this work we're able to use electronic health records and electronic medical records collected instead of having case report forms. All of those things, when you put it all together, the cost of doing this now is about a quarter of what the cost was before, and we anticipate that that will come down. So in many ways, there really is this Moore's law of, in the whole genetics area and this whole life sciences area where the costs of these things come down and down. And so your point's a very good one, that there's ways that, if there's ways that we can at a lower cost, more efficiently generate more data, whether it's through partnerships with others or even just the actual technology cost has come down, that's really going to enable us to accelerate and do, if you think about it, 4 times the number of patients for the same cost. So I think that's a terrific point. Really hadn't thought about it from a consumer standpoint, but maybe that once we get this up and running, that may be an interesting way to see, can we do something with that with the research?
We have time for one more question. So, and let's make sure it's a question. Lee, you want to shoot with your question?
I had a comment rather than a question.
Okay, so. You're not recognized. Devin,
Sorry, Lee.
People love to comment, right? Devin, excuse me, I just how I've been trained. Devin, you have a question?
I can turn it into a question.
Well, we have to give
Jeopardy.
Lee that same chance.
Well, I know. Now I feel like I'm being unfair, but but I'm going to go for it anyway. It's on the consumerism point, which is, Akwesi brought it up about sort of getting the patients involved in terms of genetic data. I would say, have you thought about ways to get patients involved in donating the clinical data? There's already been discussion of the absence of clinical data coming from EMRs and the ability of patients to sort of be able to get that data because they can and direct it. That might be a potential source of information for you. So given this, again, the success of the crowdsourcing around the questions for research, have you thought about ways to tap into what is a very engaged patient population in terms of getting more data, and not just PROs, but actual clinical data?
And Devin, the answer to that is that that is part of what we're planning to do, that when a patient consents to this, we are going direct to the patients, and that they will allow us and we've provided a way to pull in that information through their electronic health records. So our hope is that will be something that will enable us at a lower cost to aggregate this data. Now, there's a lot of questions about that about how do you reach the patients, what's your marketing strategy, how do you communicate with them, let alone the actual infrastructure of getting this done. But presuming that we can reach them and that they will consent to this, that is a way that, again, a much, much lower cost would be able to start getting more and more data and having hopefully accelerate new treatments for our patients. So I see Richard is standing here to my side. That is my cue to sit down.
But Paul, let me.
But I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here and for all that.
I want to thank you. I mean, it takes a certain element of courage to subject yourself to being put out there, sort of laid out on the operating table, so to speak, and we all learn from it. And that's the whole purpose of what we're doing, to not be a little silo, but to share and try to learn collectively. So I really want to thank you and your organization for we can hear your applause. Now, next I want to introduce Kathy Giusti, who doesn't need an introduction. And Paul has this great partnership with Kathy, right, at MMRF. And in life, I've only been privileged to have the partnership as my co-chair of this Craft Precision Medicine Accelerator. But Kathy, we wanted to get your perspective on this and overall how it relates to Craft. Please, thank you.
So I want to thank everybody too for being here. Really appreciate all of your time. And I just want to give you a little bit of perspective on MMRF since I was the founder, but also I am a multiple myeloma patient as well, for those of you who don't know that. So the real issue around starting the COMPASS study was we actually had a roundtable, and we brought in a lot of the academic centers, and at that point we were trying to focus on high-risk patients. And then we realized at that roundtable that it was going to be impossible to get all of the academic centers to share their data in a way that we could start answering questions around high risk, getting back to where Brady was on use cases. And so we kind of all came back to the MMRF office and said, you know what, we're going to have to do this ourselves. We're going to have to launch this entire study ourselves to force the data out to the public domain and get everybody to share it. And that's why we did make this $40 million investment. So then you can understand why myself as a patient, when I'm reading all of the abstracts, which by the way, I have no problem with the abstracts. I mean, this is high science. Constantine, for example, has given up his life helping us in the field of myeloma, and so has Larry. So the work they were doing was technically really strong and helpful in terms of identifying new targets in this huge, robust genomic data set that they had. But as someone who's like Ann Quinn Young in our office and myself, we concierge endless patients. And they're not necessarily asking us every day about a new target. They're asking us the two top questions. Should I do a transplant? And should I go on maintenance therapy? And for how long? And so when you're a patient yourself and you're hearing this all day long, your immediate response at the MMRF as a business person too is to say, well, how do we solve this problem? And you realize, going back to what many of you have said, it's the ecosystem. So one of the reasons we wanted to poll the patients was to say, is this just something that Ann and I are hearing in the office, or is this truly the top questions they have? So the crowd helped us to understand amongst our patients, those really were the top questions. The reason we loved it in the ecosystem is this, and I know Lincoln and Lee and Diane and us, we've all had conversations around this, but if you look at maintenance therapy, it was a spot that was a big win-win for everybody, except maybe pharma. And the reason for that was, in terms of the community oncologist, they have to make the decision. Do I put the patient on maintenance or do I not? How long do I keep the patient on maintenance? It's incredibly expensive. For the patients, we don't want to be on maintenance. If we don't need to be on maintenance, we don't want to stay on these drugs forever, but we're petrified to go off because there's nothing to tell us whether we should be on it or not. The payer is saying, why am I paying for all these myeloma patients that are living a really long time now? Do I want to be paying for them to be on these drugs for 6, 7, 8 years? It's really, really expensive. So we found, ironically, once we did the crowd and we realized everybody cared about maintenance, that was a beautiful place for us to go in and start looking at the answer fund and say, could it answer this question around maintenance for us? And indeed, we'll do the same thing around transplant. Now, Lee, Lincoln, and others of us have all had discussions that even if we answer this with what we call our best data and evidence, will that be strong enough for the payer? So will it change what they're willing to do? And we're not 100% sure about that. But if we work with the community and the health system and we say, we've got 300 patients that look like this and here's what they did, here's the data, it's still something that can be used. So I think that's what we're all wrestling with right now with the Answer Fund itself. So we are happy that academia continues to use Compass and validate targets, but we have to validate them quickly. But we also have to work with the community and the patients and the payers to look clinically and be able to answer the questions that our patients have. Statistically significant, validated, but you know what, we got to be honest with you. Some people are just saying, if you tell me what you've got and I can look at it within my own health system and you provide advice, you know what, we're really happy the MMRF did that with us too. So that's a piece of it. Now, if I leave you with nothing else, it's the understanding that what we've just shared with you are business models. So the MMRF has always been pretty good at saying, we see the science, we see the technology, how do we use a business model to drive it forward? So whether it was our tissue bank or our clinical network, or then moving on to Compass, and now the Answer Fund, we're always looking for that model. And you heard Paul talk now about CureCloud and going a direct-to-patient registry. The next model that we actually have that didn't come up today but is important because people were talking about validating targets is one that's in the clinical trial space called MyDrug, which is a platform trial that Daniel and Claire is launching September, October, which is a multi-arm study with these specific arms against these specific targets with new drugs coming in. So I don't want you to think we just stopped. You know, we use Compass, we're validating the targets, but we are also driving to the clinic once again in a highly innovative model with a platform trial to say, can we find signals in this space and move these drugs toward registration? Now, the worst thing that can happen is that the MMRF does all this great work. And by the way, the Answer Fund took us 15 months to get off the ground. Why? Because you had to talk to everybody, figure out how do you build it, figure out how you're doing the crowd, will the academics like it, will the community play? Imagine if we didn't share that with anybody. Imagine if the MMRF just said, okay, we've got all these business models and we're just going to keep doing what we do, and lung will do what they do, and breast does what they do. We would not get anywhere. So the whole frustration when you're in one of these foundations is you're so busy raising money, keeping the investors happy, keeping the ecosystem happy that you don't have the ability to share your information. Fast forward, that's why Richard and I came up to HBS and Craft, was to make sure that doesn't happen anymore, that the best business models driving science and technology forward are shared in vehicles like this that can now be sent out for everybody in the world to see. So we focus on 4 work streams up at Craft, all around the business of science. The first one somebody asked about was direct to patient. That is one work stream we had. It's run by Lori Marcus. She's amazing with a direct-to-consumer background. And basically, we bring in Peloton bikes, Marriott, Uber, everybody to help train our healthcare groups on how to go direct to the patient and come up with data, better data programs, and then again, build case studies around that we share. What you saw today was built out of our data and analytics work stream run by Gabriel, who you'll hear from in just a little bit. But Gabriel has, like Lori Marcus, an amazing background in bioinformatics, but he's also a great business strategist. He was at Patients Like Me and GNS, and so he brings a tremendous amount of credibility to that work stream. The third, then, is run by Dixie and Brad Smith on clinical trials and platform trials, where we're actually working with people like Brian Alexander and Pancreatic and Precision Promise, and making sure that all of us are sharing clinical trial design and how we get platform trials done, and sharing that with FDA. And then our fourth work stream is in the area of venture and investment, where Richard has just done unbelievable work looking at every venture model that you can possibly find in life sciences today, and then helping all the organizations to understand how do you move venture forward quickly. The reason we focus on these four areas is because you start with the patient to get the data. Once you've got the data, please don't let it sit idle. It has got to go to an AI company or other groups so that it is analyzed, so that we can validate it. Once we validate it, we want to drive it to the clinic much more efficiently. If we can drive it to the clinic, then let's make sure we're building in venture models and systems where royalties can come back in, where we can all get reinvestment and sustainable models to keep moving forward. Commercialization happens, and you help thousands and millions of patients, as opposed to just having your own little silo in your own little disease that isn't having half the impact of anything else. So the joy of being part of this is that once you're under the Craft umbrella, and for anybody who ends up watching this, and if you're not under the Craft umbrella, make sure you register with us on our website, because then you will get invited onto the campus to work directly with us on specific business problems, and or you will be coming back to other HBX programs like this that we do. And of course, then Richard and I also do a program in executive education that we'll be holding in September. So for people that want to come up as teams and work in that area, it's really effective too.